This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 350. Hank or rank. How monetary policy works or doesn't.
You issue the currency in which you borrow. And that means that you are never going to have the problems that Greece had or Argentina did.
Why did the pound initially fall? Well, that's what my former Treasury colleague Dario Perkins called the, quote, moron risk premium, unquote.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So lifting interest rates is back in vogue, but does it work? Well, not so far. I mean, inflation might be coming down a bit, but some would say that a lot of that is because of base effects, that high growth one year can make growth the next year comparatively look not so bad, but prices are still rising. People are still struggling, but this is how monetary policy says it should work. Rates up, cuts demand, and we reach equilibrium. That nirvana that the economy supposedly finds itself always reaching, in which case, why do central banks actually need to do all this hard work? And what are the models they're using? Well, the rank model is too limiting, apparently, because it ignores the distributional impacts of monetary policy. So there's the Hank model. Rank or Hank, what are they? Is Hank any better than rank? We're going to look at that this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, central banks are at it again. A couple of bank collapses, a momentary pause in interest rate hikes, but now they're back at it again. They're lifting interest as inflation, strangely, isn't coming down as fast as they expected, almost as though there's something wrong with the model, but that can't be the case. Meanwhile,
no, of course not.
Rising inflation's making the poor worse off, and rising mortgage rates obviously are hitting middle-income earners as well, because obviously it's their reckless spending that created inflation in the first place. And the other hit for lower-income earners from rising interest rates, of course, is it's just a marginal impact, is that they lose their jobs. So they have no income whatsoever. The rich, well, they seem to be okay through all of this, don't they, somehow? So, Steve, that shows how the transmission of monetary policy, the word that they like to use in central banks, the transmission mechanism, what they're using that blunt instrument of interest rates, doesn't work equally across all of society, does it? I mean, there are big winners and losers. Interestingly, central banks sort of recognise this. They talk about it, but they don't have an answer to it. They just say it's a consequence. The poor get poorer, the rich get richer. Sorry about that. We've still got to keep inflation down.
That's pretty much their attitude. But, I mean, the models, what they don't realise themselves is how their models, which they prefer to model the economy as representative agent stuff they do, exists because their theory of consumption breaks down because it doesn't include the distribution of income at all. And then they find, it doesn't fit the data, and we have these effects that we don't expect from our models. But the reason the models were evolved in the first place was to try to ignore the issue of income distribution. So I find it rather hilarious. They're going from what they call rank to Hank, representative agent, new Keynesian models, to heterogeneous agents, new Keynesian models, when the whole bloody mess of new Keynesianism sprung out of the failure to include the distribution of income in neoclassical economics right from the outset.
So let's go quickly through those as to what they mean. So rank is, so that's representative agent, new Keynesian model. So that is the idea that they change interest rates. We all change our behaviour. What, in the same way? We have one representative agent who is a person on this planet. Yeah.
A person on this planet who, by definition, can't exist, but that's never been a problem for economic theory. This is. I mean, I went to the Feshrift for Alan Kerman at the Bank of England, as it happens, about 3 weeks ago, and Alan was somebody who was a mainstream general equilibrium type modeler, but he made the huge mistake of deciding to go and check and see how an actual market functioned, which happens to be that he was working in Marseille at the time of the Marseille fish market, and then he found the way the market actually behaved had nothing to do with the conventional theory, and then he went back and took a look at the literature and saw that the whole idea of a representative agent sprung out of the failure of the theory to be able to derive one essential part of itself, and that is the idea of a downward sloping market demand curve. So economists. I often think of the Life of Brian scene where Brian comes out and speaks to the multitude who've decided that he's the Messiah and says, you are all individuals. And they say, yes, we are all individuals. One who says, I'm not. Yes. Let's call him Hank. So that's it
reminds me actually of my very early days in radio. I remember a program manager presented us all with a photograph of who our listener was.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just a picture, and we had a profile of who that person was. This is who you're talking to. So the idea that there was this uniformity in our audience, and so we spoke to Daphne or whoever it was, and rather than accepting the fact that actually there's a huge variation in society, and you've got to talk to everybody. It's a similar sort of idea.
Or you choose your niche, you choose your segment of the distribution,
or whatever it is, but not just one person. But I mean, so that's right. But central banks don't have that. Can't choose niches. They're working for everybody.
Well, yeah, but the way it came about is these classic failures. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis put it best, I think, when he, in one of his papers, he argued that neoclassical economics is a magnificent failure. You can understand the developments from one stage of the theory to the next by saying, how did the previous stage fail? And then what's their way of trying to fudge their way past that failure? So if you suffer through a mainstream economics degree, at some point they'll teach you what they call indifference curves. And that's their way of trying to model your tastes, what do you desire to consume. So they'll put one axis on a vertical axis, one good on a vertical axis and the other on the horizontal axis, and then say there's a nice smooth curve linking the two, showing you combinations of, my favourite two, bananas and biscuits. Combinations of bananas and biscuits that give you equal satisfaction. So you're indifferent between lots of bananas and very few biscuits, and lots of biscuits and very few bananas, and then that's how you decide what to consume.
Can I just complicate that? Because I want to throw a chocolate bar into that mix. How are you going to do that?
That's the third dimension. But we don't do that because paper's only two-dimensional. So because we teach students.
Then I'm going to throw in saving for a foreign holiday. So it goes on. Yeah, I mean. Yeah,
okay. So you now need a four-dimensional object, and we're in serious trouble here. Let's ignore.
I want a new car.
Let's assume a can opener. That's what they end up doing. But so what that does is it has a model of these, nice smooth curves, which give you your consumption tastes, and then a nice straight line which links how many bananas and how many biscuits you can afford given your current income. And then we change the price of one of the two, and that then means the point of intersection on one of the axes changes. But the other point of intersection remains constant because we assume when working out your demand for bananas and biscuits that changing the price of biscuits doesn't change your income. Simple assumption. Okay, I haven't actually seen any. You don't have your own kiln here to make.
No.
Okay.
No.
And I couldn't see a banana tree in your backyard.
No.
Strange because we are in south of England.
I know.
Should be warmer here.
Yeah.
Where are the banana trees? But so you can make that.
I can give you a turnip.
A turnip. This is in honour of Doug Mulray. I'll come back to that later. But that vision of you can vary the price of one without varying your income works when you're saying isolated consumer, okay? Because changing price of bananas and biscuits, neither of them is going to affect your income. But when you look at the entire society, which you have to do to derive a market demand curve. So what by definition, a market demand curve for a different particular good is the demand of all the consumers in the economy for that particular good. Now, all those consumers, some of them are going to be biscuit manufacturers. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you change the price, you are going to change their income, and that means that point that you have, which is fixed for you, is going to be up or down pretty dramatically for banana or biscuit manufacturers when we change the prices. So that therefore means that point of what was a point of rotation in the way they derive your individual demand curve becomes a moving point. So that means the demand curve you can derive can have any shape that you can draw by. It's called a polynomial shape, which sounds complicated, but what it means is it's a curve which you can draw without taking your finger off the paper and without drawing a loop and going back and intersecting yourself. That's the potential shape of the market demand curve, unless we assume that varying prices doesn't change income. Now that's That's saying, let's assume we can change, let's have a system based on prices changing incomes, and then to make it work for a market demand curve, let's assume changing prices doesn't change incomes. That's what they bloody well did.
So
that's where the representative agent came from.
Right, okay. And applied to the work of central banks then. So this representative agent idea is that, well, if we change interest rates in a particular direction, if we put them up, then there's going to be less borrowing going on. They actually end up assuming this. I mean, when you read this stuff, you really wonder where do they get the stuff that they must be on to believe this, because they literally assume that when you go shopping down at Sainsbury's, you are considering the distribution of income for your entire family dynasty, like from you and 15,000 generations that are going to come in after you from your two kids. You're making your decisions about what consumption will happen now in this infinite future that is part of your representative agent behaviour. It's sheer bloody nonsense. So the Hank model, how does that? Which is still
it's still the whole thing. New Keynesians came out of this attempt to derive macroeconomics from micro.
Right.
Slight problem. Micro can't even derive a market demand curve. So how do you solve the problem? You assume that we're all the same, and not only that we're all the same, that all goods are the same as well. So you've suddenly eliminated the entire need for a price system because there's only one. We're all eating spam, okay? And we all have exactly the same tastes for spam. That's representative agent. Strangely enough, it didn't seem to work. So now they've come for Hank, which is finally doing what, in a weird roundabout sort of way, what Alan Kermode argued for 20 or 30 years ago, that we have to treat behaviour as occurring at a higher level of aggregation than the isolated individual. And so in a weird sort of way, Hank is a failure built on a failure that takes you back to what may have been the right idea in the first place. You have to include the distribution of income in your model of both micro and macro. And that's what they're finally doing here, but ludicrously complicated and with still these crazy assumptions that we're all, when we go shopping at Sainsbury's today, we're considering the interest rate impact on the net present value of future incomes and which particular one of our 15,000 subsequent generations are going to deserve a higher bequest from us.
But it does take into account, which seems like the bleeding obvious when you're talking about interest rates, the impact
the
it
rich
has.
benefit from higher interest rates.
Well, the rich do, obviously, but also, across the board, there's the question about how much of the wealth that we have, how much of the money we have is liquid and how much of it is illiquid. So the money that you've got tied up in the mortgage, you can't spend that unless you sell your house. Beyond that, you've got liquidity. So when you push up interest rates, you are increasing how much you're spending on that illiquid portion if you've still got to pay your mortgage off, which means you've got less liquid, less spare cash, in other words.
That would mean they would have to include the level of private debt in their models. You want to take a bet into whether they do or they don't with me?
For sure.
I'd like I could do with some extra cash right now. Again, there's this incredible capacity to continue failing forward. Okay, so the first failure is they thought, this goes right back to Alfred Marshall, they thought they could easily derive market demand and supply curves. They do their mathematics on it and they find, oh dear, to derive the demand curve, we have to assume all consumers are the same and all goods are the same. Oh, that's a bit of a problem. Let's just call it the representative agent. And then now the agent does that, and then so it's progress by failure, rather than saying, oh dear, we can't get equilibrium prices out of this. We can't ignore the distribution of income. We have to look at dynamics. Let's change our paradigm. Oh no, we can't do that.
But is it a complicated model for something which is relatively easy to understand? That if you push up interest rates, those people who got a high mortgage are going to pay more. They've got less money to spend. I mean, that's the. Does interest rates do any more than that? Because the other argument, of course, is, well, the ability. If interest rates go up, then you're going to be more reluctant to borrow. But I mean, that's a nonsense, isn't it? That whole side of the argument, because you only borrow. We talked about this on the podcast before. You only borrow if you're running a business. You only borrow if you've got room for expansion. If the economy's not looking pretty sick, you won't borrow at that point, irrespective. So ignore that argument. The only thing that interest rates do really is change the mortgage rate for people, isn't it?
that's what it comes down to in the real world. But that then means the model has to include the level of private debt, the rate of change of private debt, and the impact of credit upon aggregate demand, none of which is in these models. Right. So this is what I find just so frustrating. And it's amazing watching the community, get their rocks off by, we've got this new approach we call Hank, which is so much cooler than what we used to, which was rank. And,
because it was rank.
And we used to have the Nehru, but now I've got the Ferrier. And for Christ's sake, stop coming up with the cartoon imagery. But that's what they're doing. So you're continuing to put more and more band-aids onto a failed paradigm. It gets infinitely more complicated. It's again like saying, oh dear, there are moons around Jupiter. How do we try to build a model where those moons are actually orbiting the Earth and just happen to be glancing past Jupiter all the time? We don't want to lose the paradigm of the Earth as the centre of the universe. So how do we hang on to it despite all these logical failures of the system? And that's the state of those bloody papers. And I have as little time for I've got slightly more time for Hank than I had for rank, but no time for either.
Right. Okay. Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia has just undergone a review. So they're going to, marginal changes. They're going to.
Let me guess. Did they decide things would be better if economists took over running everything?
Well, maybe they didn't quite say. They sort of said that, but we'll come back when we come back. Okay. We'll look at that because a perfect opportunity. It's probably too late now. I don't know. They were taking submissions. I bet you didn't put your paper in. You should have done. But anyway, a bit late now. But maybe they're listening. Is there a better way, taking into account the fact that there is no single representative agent, and we do need to consider the income changes that are made, that are created by central banks. How do we stop them messing things up like that? We'll look at all of that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. Back in a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we started today by looking at the difference between rank, which is quite an appropriate name really for a model for how central banks operate, and Hank, which is supposedly allowing for
heterogeneous agents,
rather than representative agents.
Yeah.
And those agents could have differing income levels, different behaviours, I guess, which is as we said, a step in the right direction. But really, if it does boil down to it's just the only thing that's changing is if you push up interest rates, asset prices go up, and for the wealthy people who've got those assets suddenly become wealthier. Is that, and then on the other side, people who've got mortgages end up paying more for those mortgages. Again,
they need to be including the level of private debt in their models.
Yeah,
and I won't quite bet the Bank of England, but I've got a very, very unlikely that that's actually ended up as a factor in their modelling. It's really what they'll be talking about is the different agents will have different expectations of the future and different responses, therefore, to the rate of interest on their inflationary expectations. And then what you get is a distribution of inflationary expectation effects, and that's then got a nice little Gaussian distribution around your mean, and you now got two means rather than one, so you can play with the numbers a bit better, and then you can explain why you didn't manage to predict the next month's inflation rate properly.
So it's all obfuscation.
It's all obfuscation. So it's designed as progress, disguised as progress, and actually believed as progress by people who are doing it, because it gives this bunch of bankers. So I went to use the wrong. I did. I almost used the wrong end of the alphabet. I meant to say central bankers, but I almost said central rankers.
Because they're following the rank model.
Now we can do the life of Brian. Release ranker. Release ranker.
So that's right. Yeah, we're a bit of a trouble with the letter R.
Those that don't know the scene, just go into YouTube and search for the.
It's all just
Brian. Release. I shall release Brian.
At some point, we're going to stop talking about economics.
Sorry.
It's going to be full Monty Python for half an hour.
I've always said Monty Python as a documentary. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was.
Mainly about England, but definitely about economists.
So the Reserve Bank of Australia, or the Reserve Bank of Australia.
The Reserve Bank
of Australia.
The Reserve Wankers of Australia.
They have just sort of like undergone a review. They're going to split themselves into two boards, one of which is going to be largely entirely economists because they need more.
Obviously, there aren't
economics.
enough economists involved in running the world. That's always been my solution to all just mad economists.
But, I mean, given that, I do wonder whether there is some hope in all of this, because there is sort of talk about maybe there needs to be more of a representation of alternative approaches. So you don't think so?
Oh, look,
so you don't,
sorry, I'm laughing out loud.
A little bit more plurality in thinking in central banks.
That'd be fun. Well, if they've got three obvious...
If you were offered the gig, would you take it?
Oh, I'd take it. Yeah, sure. There's three obvious candidates that would have got a snowflake's chance in hell of being given an invitation. Myself, Bill Mitchell, and Stephen Hale. Okay, if you want to have three prominent, non-orthodox, non-mainstream economists who are Australian, who could be given an offer for those positions. And I'm sorry. What's a decent bet? This is one time. I have no money. I'm not going to bet. I'm going to. Yeah, I probably agree with you anyway. So, but yeah, I mean, it's not going to happen. The odds of anybody outside the mainstream religion being offered those positions on the board is zero.
But those central banks must be looking and thinking, for everything we're doing, we do just seem to be making things worse. We do seem to be pushing up asset prices, and we are creating a lot of social unrest. They must see that they're responsible for that, don't they?
I do wonder. I mean, I've had a few personal run-ins with members of the Reserve Bank of Australia over time. I will recount. I won't give a name and rank here, or name and wank, as the case may be. But at one time, I made a comment about how I was talking about Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, so I got invited to give a presentation of that to central bank, Reserve Bank staff, I think it was in Melbourne at the time. And a member of the audience, who shall remain anonymous, said, "Look, Steve, we've read all that stuff." And my reply was, "No, okay, yes, I can be rude, quite true." I said, "Well, then can I congratulate you therefore on ignoring good sense?"
Right.
That obviously, I'm sure that really improved my chances of being offered a position this time round.
It's never going to happen. So, but if I just want, there has to be another way, though, doesn't there? There has to be centrist, because it's clear. If you look at the one thing that we can say about the one fact we can take out of central banks is that when they push up interest rates, people do struggle with their mortgages.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the effectiveness, and then the effectiveness of, if the idea is that if we make people struggle with their mortgage, they'll spend less. If they spend less, then there's going to be less demand. So we'll sort out that discrepancy between demand and supply, and that ultimately will bring down prices.
That's what's really going on. Okay?
Right.
But what they talk about is changing inflationary expectations.
Yeah, but that's what's going on. And it's clear that it's going on because if you look around the world, you can see where it's working faster and where it's working slower. And where it's working fastest is countries where people, by and large, have an interest rate which is, just the current interest rate. They don't have a fixed interest rate. They've got a variable interest rate mortgage.
Yeah.
The countries with a very high fixed mortgage, it's working slower.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as clear as day. That's what's happening.
Yeah, Australia's got flexible mortgage rates. So when the Reserve Bank whacks up the rate the next day, you get an email from the bank saying we've adjusted your mortgage by 0.25%.
Yeah.
And it's screwing aggregate demand in the countries which have variable rates and having a slower effect in those with fixed. Well, isn't that amazing? So,
and in the UK, where we've got inflation still very high and interest rates shooting up all the time, and the central bank is going to do a couple more probably, or probably a few more. Who knows? We've got a lot of people who, by the very nature here, you get 3 or 5 year fixed mortgage rates, and then you move on to another bank. You renegotiate at that period.
Yeah.
So we're largely on fixed. There's very few people on variable rates in this country, so it has less impact. So I mean, it's as clear as day that that's what's happening. But is that fair enough, that approach?
Well, what it means is the way that a central bank can regulate the economy is by causing a recession.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
For poor people.
For poor people, in particular, because again, and this is partly the argument that Warren Mosley's making quite a bit on Twitter these days, that the interest rate increases actually benefit owners of bonds. Now, has another backfire, which is one thing I have to say I didn't pay enough attention to. We spoke about this in an earlier podcast. Putting up the rates reduces the value of the bonds the banks currently have, because the bond prices are inversely related to the interest rate. So they might be getting a higher cash flow out of the new bonds that are issued, but the old bonds, which are fixed coupon rate bonds, they've got the same sort of problem we spoke about earlier with fixed interest rates. You don't change the amount of money you get on those bonds by putting up the rates. What you do is reduce their value, and that's extremely damaging to the banking sector. So we have central banks.
But if you buy them now, But if you buy them now,
buy them now. But I hate using the word, but that's the marginal effect there. The bulk, by far, is you're reducing the value of your assets. So we have central banks on one hand increasing financial fragility by putting up rates and reducing the value of the assets the banks have. And yes, okay, they can do a certain amount of hedging, but the entire system can't hedge. So unless they can pretend they're holding all those bonds to maturity rather than having them available for sale, and unless if there's a bank run, we're screwed. And it's no longer a bank run by the poor households turning up there. It's the rich, as we saw with Silicon Valley Bank, rich venture capitalists pulling their money out. They can cause the whole thing to collapse. So we've got financial fragility on one side and suppressing aggregate demand on the other by hitting the consumer with increased interest rates in the countries where the variable rates have immediate impact, and more slowly, but again more catastrophically, when you have fixed rates. And if the transition goes from you've got a fixed rate of 2%, and then when you've got to renegotiate it goes to 5%. There's some very scared people out there.
So the other issue as well is that and I read this in one of those papers arguing for the Hank model versus the rank model, related to. But I mean, it's it's a falsehood anyway. That when basically the relationship between the work of the central bank and a government's fiscal policy, they're not totally separate. So when you push up interest rates, obviously you're pushing up the cost of the Treasury's borrowing, and then that causes the government to say, well, okay, we need to spend more paying off our debt.
Well, in fact, that's not getting the accounting right. But
I mean, that's the way it's seen.
That's the way it's seen.
And that's the way they behave.
Yeah.
Therefore, they reduce their spending, which is what we're seeing in the UK. So you almost get here we are, the chips are down, households are struggling to survive. We're having to pay more, but we can't afford to pay more because interest rates have gone up. Therefore, we're going to stop spending in other areas. So we'll ensure the demise of the economy that much faster.
And fundamentally, you've got government policymakers following what mainstream economists tell them to do, stuffing up both the Treasury and the central bank. Yeah. And that's intriguing.
So aggregate spending is that much less through all of this because you've got less spending by the government, less spending by the private sector as well.
Yeah, in America, this, again, going on some of Warren's tweets recently, it seems that the American government is still running a fairly substantial budget deficit. And then the rates is, again, I think
we're about to hit a debt ceiling, though, so that's going to be they'll put an end to that.
Okay. But you've got a boost from the fiscal policy in the America, matched at the same time by interest rates going up, not affecting their mortgage rates because they have a fixed system of mortgage rates, affecting the fragility of the financial system, which is what we saw with Silicon Valley Bank, but also for those who are buying the new bonds now, giving them an income boost from the increased interest rates on the bonds, which are paid by government money creation. But I had a look at the European data for a conference I spoke at in Barcelona this week, actually. Last week.
Actually, a couple of weeks ago.
A couple of weeks ago. Maybe a month or two ago, depending on when we broadcast these live shows.
Don't give away too much.
Oh, sorry, pardon. Okay, where was I? But anyway, they're looking at all
a few weeks ago we were.
Okay,
yeah.
Looking at all the fiscal policy in Europe, it's incredibly deflationary. Some of the countries, in terms of looking at the rate of change of government debt, it's hitting -10% and -20% of GDP in some countries. A huge fiscal drag on the European Union. So I would not be amazed to see Europe hitting a fairly substantial slowdown while America and the UK continue having inexplicable growth for a while because their fiscal policies are not being constrained by the Maastricht Treaty and the attempt that the European Central Bank is imposing upon the countries of Europe to reduce their fiscal their deficits. So it's a messy world out there.
It is a messy world, and we get back into that whole thing about the role of the government versus the role of central banks.
Yeah.
So poor people in the UK are struggling because, for example, just one tiny example, we're not seeing any changes to tax brackets. So more people, so the tax-free area stays where it is. So more people creep in with inflation, creep into paying tax. Lower tax income earners move up a bracket and start paying. All of a sudden, find a portion of their income is on 40% tax, whereas it might have been 25 or whatever it was beforehand. So I mean, all of that, but it raises the question: what should be the role of central banks in managing? Getting back to what we were talking about, how do they manage the equality within the economy? Should it be part of their remit?
It should be, and all the things they've left out of their foundation models. Again, this is the point that I hammer for people who haven't done an economics degree and therefore think economists are experts on money. Mainstream economic theory has always left money out of its modelling, so they don't have money or banks or debt in their macroeconomic models, whether they're rank or wank or hank. Because the real world refuses to go away, then it causes those models to not quite fit the data, despite how much they fudge their parameters. And now they bring in things like hank to get away from what rank couldn't do because wank was in the way.
So the broader question is monetary policy actually the way to manage inflation?
No.
So it should be fiscal policy.
Fiscal policy, and this is partly where the inflation has come from. If you look at the scale of the stimulus we had during COVID, was absolutely vital. Otherwise, there would have been a huge financial crisis as well as the health crisis. But that then meant people had much more money in their bank accounts, huge deficits, as much as 25% of GDP, huge increase in people's cash flows. They spent more, and what that meant for in terms of how that was responded to by manufacturers, they suddenly saw, in this Koleskian sense, they didn't see as much competition anymore. Everything was in the warehouse was being trucked out and sold. Put your margins up. So what actually caused the inflation wasn't wages rising. It wasn't wage push inflation. It was margin push inflation.
Yeah, because because people would still buy it because they had the money sitting there in the bank account.
Because the ceiling that was set by money creation was suddenly pushed sky high by 25% of GDP deficits. Yeah, and so
rather than having you spend the money on that, let's push up your mortgage rate so you've got less money to spend, so you feel worse off. But I mean that's no one feels great about that, do they? So, but then the alternative of the fiscal approach would be to say, what, we put taxes up for everybody, so you got less money to spend. How do we get people to stop?
It comes down to seeing what, and this is where I'm going to differ with modern monetary theory on this particular point. The classic post-Keynesian way of seeing inflation is it's a struggle over the distribution of income, and with the money creation by the government or by the private sector creates headroom for that struggle and benefits one group over another. And this time around, the aftermath of the COVID stimulus was to free the hands of the manufacturers so they could push up prices by higher markups. You really have to have the sort of meeting behind closed doors stuff that J.K. Galbraith used to do when he was responsible for price setting in the Second World War. You may have negotiations. You limit the markups. You simply say you cannot put the prices up that much,
or you use some other threat. So for here's a thought: if the issue is, it's a question of timing, isn't it? Like you've got too much money available now that you're going to spend in a very short period of time. You start to worry about inflation. You might even spend it quicker because you're worried about prices going up. So you want to get stuff while it's cheaper. But if there's a way that you could delay that spending, through some form of incentive, like saying, for example, put it into your pension.
Well, that's where Australia
will reduce the cost of your pension contributions.
If you look at where superannuation came from, that was actually Australia's government attempt to avoid inflation, was to say rather than passing on the wage rises during the 70s and 80s to workers' wages, put it into their pensions instead. Right. So you had wage rises being less than the rate of inflation, but a higher amount going into superannuation.
So I feel good because I'm paying less tax.
Yeah.
I'm not spending as much money. And if those discussions between the government and suppliers, look, if you keep on pushing rates up like this and increasing your margins, not only might we penalise you, we might also cut down the tax so even more money goes into super or pension payments, so people have got even less money to spend. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, Isabella Weber's done some very good work from the University of Amherst in Massachusetts, and looking at the level of the markup that now applies. How much prices marked up over cost of production over time. Well, we now have some of the highest markups in history. So the beneficiaries of this inflation have not been the workers. It's been the manufacturers. It's been the producers. And you have to, you have to find a way to bring pressure on them to drop their margins. Now, the trouble is, if you try to do it through blunt macroeconomic methods, then you reduce the level of money creation by the government far below what it was during COVID period. You cause a recession. Who's that going to weaken? It ends up hitting the workers cop it again. So
how do you get over that then, just very quickly? If we're looking and who does it? Is it a job for the Treasury or the government, or is it a job for the central bank? How do you keep inflation under control in a way that might hurt the top end of town, but it's not going to hurt the workers?
Well, this is, you have to see what's causing it. And like when I do the Keynesian breakdown of inflation, I find that by far at the moment change in markups is what's driving the inflation, not change in wages. Partially also it's reduction in output per worker, which is an issue with all the supply constraints we face in energy and so on. But you look at it and you say it's the markups that are causing the trouble. Now, to actually find that conclusion, I had to derive what the markups were, because lo and behold, they don't record them. They do record output per worker. They do record wage changes. They don't record markups. We're ignoring the major factor.
Get to the end of the year, we see what their earnings are, of course, so we know that they're making, lots more money than they were previously as well. So we can see it that way.
So, but you have to say, well, if you don't collect the data, you're not about to be able to have the influence over the issue either. And this says we really have to say it's who's causing it. It's not the workers, it's the capitalists. We have to control their behaviour, not the behaviour of the workers. Smashing the labour unions is highly unlikely to be a cause that is going to break the back of the inflation, when it's not the unemployed workers who are causing, nor even the employed workers who are causing the inflation.
But it's hard to say, well, we're going to introduce regulations that, and that's a government, obviously not a central bank issue, to control markups. Is there, to try and stop that happening, is there any other instrument?
I think you end up with but this is what happened during the Second World War, and like in that particular case, the manufacturers were willing to sit around a table and say, yes, okay, we won't put our prices up. We won't take advantage of the additional demand you're generating by wanting to build all these Sherman tax and Liberty ships and so on. We'll keep our markups under control.
But if you sucked money out of the private sector somehow, so that those markups became less possible, and you upped government spending, wouldn't that be the direction you'd want to go?
Well, then you end up with unemployed workers, and this comes back to one of our modern monetary theory policies.
Not if they're working for the government, of course.
Well,
but then they create the demand, which enables those prices to be pushed up, I guess. Yeah.
Well, you said a lot of this inflation, I think, is just going to be inevitable over time because of the third factor. It's not markups, it's not wages, it's going to be the sheer cost of production. That increasing because of globalised supply chains breaking down, higher cost of energy and lower quality minerals to be processed. So all these things are going to mean that inflation is more likely to be a future event. And if that it comes at the cost of workers' salaries, then you're going to have a breakdown of the social compact that gave us the post-war economic success was out of expectation that the gains would be shared by all segments of society. And so that's very much what's not happening at the moment.
And there we are. It took well over half an hour to get there, but there's the doomsday scenario from Steve. Breakdown of society, high inflation, workers revolting, I'm
the usual cheerful influence, I know.
There we are. Look, next time, what are we going to talk about next time? I don't know, actually. Yes, we're going to talk about central banks again.
Oh, dear.
There's this big move to have central bank digital currencies. So what are they? What do they hope to achieve? Are they doing it because they're worried about Bitcoin and all these alternate currencies that may be challenging the influence that central banks can have? We'll look at that next week on the Debunking Economics podcast.
Okay.
The Debunking Economics podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.